I like Tucker Carlson a lot. I like most of his views. I like that he tries to take the moral Christian stance on most things. And I like how he manages to get the most informative persons on his podcast. But his recent interview with the US ambassador to Israel, I think, in some ways, fell short of the mark. If you are going to interview someone like Mike Huckabee, who is a seasoned debater, a Christian Zionist minister, and a senior public figure, you need not only to be prepared to back your point of view, but more importantly, to challenge his points. How could you interview a Christian Zionist about his support of Israel without having a very clear idea of what Christian Zionism is? Tucker, I feel, let him get away with way too many crucial and contentious points. I will go through these one by one. Huckabee very early brought up the issue of Israel's right to exist. He asked Tucker this directly, and Tucker did not have a clear answer. Perhaps because Tucker sensed that giving a clear yes would give support to Huckabee's later points, which it did.
But a Zionist simply means somebody who believes that Israel has a right to exist. Now, the question is, do you believe Israel has a right to exist?
I guess. I mean, I want Israel to exist.
Had Tucker foreseen this to be one of Huckabee's major points, which it certainly was, he would have thought it through, I'm sure. A clear and unequivocal no, they certainly don't have a right to exist would have shocked Huckabee and immediately challenged his key premise. But in fact, the state of Israel should never have been established without a corresponding state of Palestine. You cannot hope to have a two-state solution, which has always been the plan, when you recognize only one state. That is clearly wrong on so many fronts. Had Tucker taken this opening gambit by the throat and shown it to be the fallacy that it is, Huckabee would not have been sitting back as comfortably throughout the interview as he was. I was really surprised that Tucker did not challenge him more on his professed Christianity. When asked about the very odd concept of a Christian Zionist, instead of challenging the innate inconsistency of this term, Tucker seemed back-footed and confused as to what the term meant.
What is a Christian Zionist? What does that mean to you? What does it mean?
I don't know.
There is nothing in Christianity or even Judaism, for that matter, that demands belief or even the existence of a state of Israel. That may sound strange, but the idea of forming a state of Israel began by Zionists in the early 1900s. And at that time, the prominent rabbis did not support it. The reason for the rabbis' objections was that, according to the Old Testament, only the Messiah can restore the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Hence, this movement was seen as heretical. Christians, on the other hand, have always looked to the New Jerusalem as a spiritual rather than an earthly place. So the idea of a state of Israel was not universally welcomed by either Jews or Christians. Huckabee also relied heavily on the Abrahamic promise of Genesis 12.
So if I believe in the Old and the New Testament, I do believe that There is a very specific call to the Jewish people that started with Abraham, and he called them out of what is now modern-day Iraq, said, "Come where I send you." He came. This is the land. Genesis 12:3. He says, "I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you." In Genesis 17, he looks out at the world. He says, "Look, and this is where I'm giving you the land."
To his credit, Tucker did try to challenge this by asking, who exactly are the descendants of Abraham for whom this promise was meant? Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all descendants of Abraham with genetic and spiritual links. Huckabee claims the Jews hold the strongest link on both counts. Tucker challenged this by showing that there are non-Jews in Gaza with ancestors who have lived there in unbroken succession since before Christ.
Because there are a lot of people in the territory that Israel controls today, particularly in the West Bank, who, through genetic testing, we can know their families have been here for thousands of years. We don't know whether they practiced Judaism, whether they were Samaritans, pre-Islam. We don't know that. A lot of them we know have been Christians for 2,000 years. They have less of a right to the land than someone whose ancestors, the only thing we know about them is they lived in Latvia or Poland. They're Eastern European. How does that work?
But Huckabee was not going to give in on this and continued to claim that only the Jews could show this genetic link. It is only when he found that his claim to exclusive genetic heritage was shaky, after Tucker challenged Netanyahu's weak links to any Middle Eastern ancestry, and that he had no significant religious links, did Huckabee use the subtle, deceitful technique of applying the characteristics of modern-day Jews to early Abrahamic descendants.
So the current prime minister's ancestors weren't from here within recorded history. He has no deed. Bibi Netanyahu, on one side, his family's from Poland. They're from Eastern Europe. So how do we know that he has a connection to the people who God promised the land to, Abram's descendants? How do we know that? Netanyahu's parents did not speak Hebrew. Okay, they didn't live in this region. Netanyahu, the founders of this country, were mostly secular. Some of them were avowed atheists. They were not praying for the peace of Jerusalem. They weren't praying at all because they didn't believe in God. There's no genealogy linking their families to the people of this land 3,000 years ago. They're not. So how do we know, since they didn't share a language, they didn't share a religion, they had no religion whatsoever, how do we know that they had a right to come here from Eastern Europe and
but they were
take the land?
They were,
but how do we know that Bibi, specifically Bibi's ancestors, ever lived here? How do we know that?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
How do we know if the Prime Minister of Israel's ancestors ever lived?
Maybe I could ask you, how do we know they didn't? I mean,
well, it's on the basis of the claim that they did that all kinds of things happen. People are displaced. There's a money flow. I mean, it's a big question. A lot hangs on this. It's not some theoretical thing like, oh, you know, did my grandparents do this or do that? It's like, no, we have a right to be here because my ancestors were here. Okay, how do we know they were here?
I'm totally unable to process what you're trying to get at.
According to Huckabee, the true descendants of Abraham has the following characteristics. 1, they must have the same scripture. 2, they must pray to the same God. And 3, they must face Jerusalem when praying.
If they speak the same language, if they worship the same God, if they follow the same Bible, if they follow the same cultures and traditions, and they always pray next year in Jerusalem, and they pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and they pray facing toward Jerusalem, does that not give you a little bit of a clue as to who they are?
Let's go.
Now remember that God's promises were made to Abraham and his descendants, not to the Jews or the nation of Israel specifically. In fact, there was no nation of Israel at the time the promises were made. Abraham did not have the 613 rules that Jews later developed. The Torah, in fact, only came into being 1,000 years after Abraham. And even so, the Jews that did not undergo the exile but remained in the ancestral land do not recognize many of the prophetic books of the Old Testament. So even amongst Jews, the scriptures does vary. The only covenantal practice of Abraham was circumcision, and this is not an exclusive Jewish practice. Most Muslims circumcise. Even so, it is clear that the early Christians, most of whom were Jewish, did away with this practice at the First Council of Jerusalem. Again, the practice of facing to Jerusalem during prayer was only established 1500 years after Abraham, around 500 BC. If we are to follow Abraham's example of faith, we should note that Abraham himself never attempted to wipe out an entire nation, as Netanyahu is attempting. In fact, quite the opposite. It was Abraham who pleaded with God for the corrupt people of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and bargained with God to spare the cities if he found even 10 innocent persons. So Abraham, like all Christians, would not agree with the often accepted principle of collateral damage. Abraham would never accept that one can kill the innocent because the perceived guilty is living amongst them. So, when his nephew Lot had a dispute over land with him, Abraham did not wage war on Lot, but shared the land, giving Lot the first pick. So if Abraham were in charge today, he would probably have reached an amicable agreement with the Palestinians a long time ago. Now, as Christians, both Tucker and Huckabee are professed practicing Christians. The Christian view is clear and supported by numerous New Testament passages that the Christians and not the Jews are the spiritual children of Abraham. Jesus in John chapter 8 verses 51 to 58, in response to the Jews challenging his authority and holding up Abraham as the ultimate authority, had this to say, I quote, Abraham himself rejoices to see my day. And again, before Abraham was, I am. Clearly establishing that he was God, i.e., the very God who made the promises to Abraham, the very God who established a new covenant in his blood at the Last Supper. Jesus is the fulfillment of all the prophecies, covenants, and promises of the Old Testament. Jesus is the firstborn of the new kingdom. Hence, all Christians are his spiritual descendants and heirs of the Abrahamic covenant and promises. He follows the entire Bible, both Old and New. Yet, his quotation of Genesis 12 is incomplete. He stops after the verse stating that those who bless Abraham and his descendants will be blessed, and those who curse them would themselves be cursed. But the very next sentence proclaimed that through Abraham's descendants, all nations of the world would be blessed. Now, in what way could anyone think that the nations of this world have been blessed by the Jews, when the number of Jewish agency to non-Jews can be counted on one hand, and even those all have a bias towards Jewish clientele? chosen descendants would be as numerous as the sands and the stars. How could this apply to the Jews of today? There are only 15 million in this world of 8,000 million people. That is 0.1% of the world's population. Nowhere close to the 30% who are Christians and the other 30% who are Muslims. Further, God promises Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, not just one nation. So it seems that God, unlike Netanyahu, recognized that many nations would have claim to this land. In essence, Jews have over the centuries looked upon God as their property, not to be shared with anyone. They see God as being on their side, never asking if they are on God's side. Jesus came to change this narrow view of the Old Testament and to offer it to all people. Hence, all peoples are blessed by the followers of the true heir of the promises, who is Jesus himself, and not by the sect of Judaism that have rejected him and continues to cling to real estate on tenuous historical grounds. My point here is that although present-day Jews carry the label, they in no way have a unique claim to be heirs to the Abrahamic promise and covenant. In the latter part of the interview, Tucker did come into his own, especially when he took Huckabee to tasks about claiming that there is the lowest combatant to civilian ratio in this war compared to any other in history.
How many civilians have been killed by the IDF in Gaza?
We don't know. You know why we don't know?
What's your guess?
Well, the only numbers we have come from this dubious entity called the Gaza Health Ministry. You know who that is?
Well, why
it's
doesn't
Hamas.
Israel have some kind of count on it?
We also know that a lot of the people who were killed were in fact warriors. Sadly,
how many kids were killed?
We don't know.
What's your guess?
I don't know. I'm sure it was thousands, and it's thousands too many.
Of kids were killed.
Some of the kids who were killed had been recruited to be in the military. Kids as young as 14 years old.
Kids. Do you hear yourself?
That Israel goes to lengths that no other country, including ours, goes to in the middle of an urban war, and yet Israel ended up with fewer civilian deaths in an urban war than any urban war of record.
You said you didn't know how many civilian deaths there were, so how can you say that?
If you took Gaza's numbers, Hamas's numbers,
you said you don't know what the numbers are.
We don't.
You just told me that. Then how can you say it's a lower number?
Well done, Tucker. He cannot logically say on one hand that he does not know the number of civilian casualties and still claim to give any meaningful ratio of combatants to civilians. Congrats also to Tucker on taking him to task when he claims that the U.S. Green Beret Aguila was a liar, even though he might have probed further into how likely a U.S. soldier would be to make up such a story that was backed by photographs and videos. And if he did make it up, what may have contributed to him making such a claim? I suppose the question is, how could the U.S. ambassador do such a thing without challenge? Isn't he supposed to represent his country and its citizens in a foreign country? This was just shameful and very disappointing. This is especially offensive after he kept pointing to the U.S. flag pinned to his lapel and reiterating over and over that he is not swayed by Israel's lobby. But Tucker did allow many unsupported pro-Israel claims without challenge. For example, when Huckabee quotes the various international resolutions that recognize the state of Israel, it seemed an ideal place to challenge him on the over 60 UN resolutions that condemned Israel's occupation of territories that are not part of its recognized borders, and in fact to challenge him on the USA's use of its veto power to block these resolutions. Had him a bit riled when he argued that if a state exists, if it abides by international law, then the corollary that it gives up its right to exist if it fails to abide by international law seems only logical. But suddenly, Huckabee disregards this very international law when it suits him, labeling the ICC and the ICJ rogue organizations. Clearly, this was a valid point to pursue.
You've brought up international at least twice, maybe three times, as a basis for Israel's legitimacy. If Israel was out of compliance with international law, whatever that is, would it be less legitimate?
Depends on if the law and the way it's applied is legitimate.
To say that Israel-Palestine war is unique because in no other war were the combatants on one side intermingling with civilians is just clearly untrue. The Vietnam War, the IRA in the Irish War of Independence of 1919 to 1920, the Algerian Revolution in 1954, the Jews themselves engaged in guerrilla warfare in World War II. The concept is very old and is described even in the Art of War by Sun Tzu in the 5th century BC. By and large, I thoroughly enjoyed the interview, and it was very revealing of the person and bias of the US ambassador. It is truly worrying that the US representative to another country seems to care more about defending the image of this country than his own.